Welcome to this explainer. If you turn on the news today, you'll likely hear terms like Islam, Islamism, and radicalization thrown around totally interchangeably. But what if the narratives we're being sold are, well, fundamentally flawed? Today, we're stepping away from all the heated emotion and rhetoric to look closely at the actual data and history. We're going to untangle these deeply misunderstood concepts using empirical research to get right to the core of what's really going on.
So let's dive right in by asking a really big question, one that media and politicians honestly often blur on purpose to construct fear-based narratives. Are these three terms actually describing the exact same phenomenon? You hear them used as synonyms all the time, but treating them like they're identical isn't just some minor vocabulary mistake. It literally leads to fundamentally flawed global policies and deeply fractured societies.
To get to the truth, we're going to systematically unpack the evidence through 6 structured sections: faith versus political ideology, the colonial roots of Islamism, transforming jihad and statecraft, the Iranian Shia paradigm, the realities of radicalization, and finally repression versus prevention. We're going to strip away the myths to reveal the historical and sociological realities.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, faith versus political ideology. We really need to establish a baseline and define our terms.
Now, here's a genuinely surprising fact. Islamism is not some ancient religious artifact from the 7th century. It's actually a distinctly modern political ideology. The scholarly consensus shows that Islamism emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, directly in response to the rise of the secular nation-state and the incredibly unequal conditions created by global Western power. It is a political reaction, and its main goal is state capture and the enforcement of a very specific legal system. This really illustrates the massive fracture between the two. On one hand, you have Islam, a personal faith system, a spiritual practice, and a rich historical tradition of lived religion. But on the other hand, you have Islamism. This is a distinctly modern political ideology, often organized into modern political parties, actively fighting for governmental control to enforce religious law from the top down. One is a religion, while the other is a political movement that just uses the vocabulary of that religion to achieve state power.
Moving on to Section 2, the colonial roots of Islamism. Let's look at where this actually came from.
If we trace the historical timeline, a really clear pattern builds. Islamism didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was deeply shaped by European colonialism, which heavily disrupted traditional societies and dismantled historic institutions. Take the 1920s, for example. The fall of the Ottoman Caliphate left a massive political vacuum, and traditional religious institutions were completely sidelined. Fast forward to the 1970s, and as post-colonial secular regimes failed to deliver economic prosperity, we see the rise of a brand new pan-Islamic identity movement stepping in to fill that void.
And this is where the empirical data totally flips the script. Historical underdevelopment in these regions wasn't caused by Islamic religious doctrine itself. Instead, the data shows us that colonial powers and missionaries simply invested far fewer resources into state building, education, and administration in areas under Islamic rule compared to other places. This lack of historical investment severely stunted bureaucratic capacity, creating the exact economic and social grievances that modern political movements would later exploit.
Which brings us to Section 3, transforming jihad and statecraft. This is a major ideological shift.
The absolutely crucial takeaway here is that modern jihadism is a totally new invention. Under traditional Islamic jurisprudence, jihad was largely defined as a collective duty managed by a state authority, like a caliph, with extremely strict rules of engagement. It was actually a lot like the Western just war tradition. But modern jihadism? Pioneered by 20th century figures like Sayyid Qutb and later weaponized by al-Qaeda, this concept was radically transformed into an individual obligation using indiscriminate violence across borders against pretty much all enemies. It's not a return to medieval tradition at all. It's a boundaryless revolutionary doctrine.
In groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda, they function exactly like modern revolutionary movements. They're not relying on ancient methods. They bypass mainstream media entirely. In fact, their digital magazines and encrypted campaigns often resemble modern corporate marketing more than ancient holy wars. They're outsourcing recruitment globally via digital networks to reach vulnerable individuals thousands of miles away, and relying heavily on social media echo chambers to amplify their reach. It's a modern, digital-first insurgency.
Now let's shift gears for Section 4, the Iranian Shia paradigm, to see how this political awakening manifested differently.
What's really fascinating here is that historically, mainstream Shia theology heavily leaned toward political quietism. They essentially kept religion separate from the messy business of running a state until the return of the hidden imam. But the 1979 Iranian Revolution changed absolutely everything. The introduction of vilayat-e faqih, or the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, was highly unprecedented. It centralized absolute political and religious authority right into the hands of a single cleric, fundamentally altering the entire trajectory of Shia political thought.
And this newly formed Islamic Republic quickly needed a way to consolidate that power. During the incredibly brutal 1980 Iran-Iraq War, the state took the traditional, deeply spiritual Shia narrative of martyrdom and totally transformed it into a hyper-nationalist tool for mass mobilization. By making the nation itself sacred, the state effectively weaponized religious history to mobilize everyday citizens for a modern geopolitical conflict.
Okay, on to Section 5, the realities of radicalization. We've looked at the history, but how does an individual actually become radicalized?
Empirical science proves that radicalization is never just a simple, linear path of religious brainwashing. It's not a conveyor belt. Rather, it's a complex collision of these four sociological factors. You need grievances, whether that's real political marginalization or perceived injustices. You need social networks that expose the individual to persuasive peer pressure. You need an ideology that frames the world in black and white and actually sanctions violence. And finally, you need support structures like online forums or local hubs that enable action. It takes all four of these pieces violently colliding together to push someone over the edge.
Now, I want you to pay really close attention to this number. 0. That is the statistical significance of a country's Muslim population size in predicting conflict onset when you actually control for real, underlying drivers like poverty, dependence on oil wealth, authoritarianism, and a high youth population. When researchers run the data and strip away the socioeconomic and political failures of the state, religion as a variable literally drops to 0. The root causes of these conflicts are deeply political and economic, for sure, not inherently religious.
This brings us to our final area, Section 6, Repression versus Prevention. It's time to evaluate our global strategies.
This quote from the literature perfectly captures the tragic loop we find ourselves in. Heavy-handed, authoritarian state repression often provides the exact grievances that extremists need to recruit more fighters. When states react to violence by indiscriminately cracking down on entire communities, restricting civil liberties, and using collective punishment, well, they're quite literally doing the recruiters' jobs for them. It just becomes this completely self-sustaining cycle of violence and repression.
So what actually works? The research shows we have to move way beyond just reactive policing. Successful strategies treat the root sociological causes, fostering inclusive environments so vulnerable individuals don't feel isolated enough to seek out extremist networks in the first place. You have to build multi-agency, community-based programs that address specific psychological needs. It's about building up state capacity and treating the underlying conditions, not just reacting to the violent symptoms.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this pretty provocative thought. We've seen the data, we've traced the history, and we understand the sociology now. So, if repressive state actions reliably fuel the fire of extremism, are our current global strategies actually solving the problem, or are they simply feeding the cycle? Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this incredibly complex topic, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the narratives and looking closely at the evidence.